I'm Alan Mortis, and this is Think Radio Presents Think Planet. My guest today is Dr. Devon Peña.
The colonizer is as injured as the colonized. That the colonizers may be the ones perpetrating violence, but when you engage in an act of violence, that's traumatic.
Yes, it
That's
is.
why our soldiers, our warriors, have PTSD. When white folks become aware of the fact that they too are damaged goods because of settler colonialism, that will, I think, open up doors and windows for conversations for healing.
Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio.
Think Planet is made possible by support from the Western Colorado University School of Environment and Sustainability, empowering future change agents to foster ecologically resilient, economically sustainable, and socially just communities throughout the world.
If you like Think Planet, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think People, a celebration of just how amazing people can be. Think Business, a weekly discussion with entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors on sustainable business into the 21st century. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. Since 1999, Peña has served as Professor of American Ethnic Studies and Anthropology at the University of Washington, where he directed the PhD program in environmental anthropology for 6 years. He's also the founder and president of the Acequia Institute. That's a nonprofit devoted to preserving and strengthening traditional communal irrigation farming practices in the San Luis Valley of Colorado. It's an old water rights arrangement that predates the 19th century westward expansion of the American frontier. Peña splits his time between his farm in the San Luis Valley and his academic duties in Washington. He's a prolific writer and most recently the author of Mexican Origin Foods, Foodways and Social Movements, Decolonial Perspectives. He's a passionate advocate of what he calls the decolonization of identity among indigenous people. And that's what we're going to talk about today, among other things. Devon, thanks for joining me.
It's my privilege. Thank you for the invitation.
One thing I've noticed about you through the years, having heard you speak and so forth, is that you don't take on small topics.
This is true.
Because I think about this whole idea of indigeneity and redefining what it means and mining it for sources of empowerment for peoples. And that's no small task. But before we get to the details of that, and I love the way you've framed that and sort of broken it down into some very bite-sized pieces, I want to hear your story. I mean, what is it that has led you into a lifetime of studying this topic and topics like these?
I would definitely have to start with my abuelita, with my grandmother, Margarita Peña. Growing up in Laredo, Texas, right on the U.S.-Mexico border, Texas, Tamaulipas, we lived in a family and in a community that was very multicultural. But my grandmother was a seed saver. And I recall asking her, why do you put those seeds in the little jars next to the stovetop? And she said in Spanish, she was German Jewish and married a Mexican, but she didn't really talk English. She only spoke German and Spanish. And Margarita told me, in response to my question, why do you put the seeds away? She said something that has really stuck with me ever since. She said, porque la semilla es la memoria de la planta de cómo vivir bien en este lugar. Because the seed is the memory of the plant of how to live well in this place. And ever since then, as I watched my grandmother do her gardening and using companion planting all kinds of floral species that go along with corn, bean, and squash, I really have to thank my grandmother for getting me on this path.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that is reflected in this latest book that you wrote. I mean, the idea that indigeneity and food are absolutely interwoven. When was there ever a time in human history when food was separated from what it meant to belong to a place?
And what it means to be a human being, and what it means to be a healthy human being. Mm-hmm. And I'm really struck right now by the movement that exists in our country to decolonize our diet. That's the title of a book by one of my co-editors, Decolonizing Your Diet by Luz Calvo. And the idea here, even the Mexican government just last year announced that the way to fight obesity and diabetes in Mexico is to get people to return to the traditional milpa diet, which is mainly plant-powered, meaning corn, bean, squash, amaranth, and all the wonderful varieties of fruits and squashes and pumpkins that grow in Mexico. That in fact, Mexico is a major Vavilov center, as we all know, where a lot of the foods that are now eaten across the planet were first domesticated from their wild relatives.
Well, and you've made that point really strongly, is that were it not for native Mexican people cultivating these plants throughout history, our diet everywhere would be a lot poorer.
It would be greatly impoverished, yes.
Yeah. And so back up just a second, though, and tell us, what is a Vavilov Center?
Well, a Vavilov Center is where the wild ancestors of our domesticated crops were first cultivated by indigenous people. So Gary Paul Navon wrote a beautiful book called Where Does Our Food Come From? Where he tracked, Vavilov was a Russian scientist, and he was interested in answering the question, where does our food come from? So he did extensive travels throughout Mexico and the American Southwest. And Gary Paul Navon in his book recounts the story of Vavilov's travels through Mexico, through Mesoamerica, which would include the American Southwest. And so a Vavilov Center is any area where the wild relatives of domesticated crops still exist and are interacting with them. So that, for example, if you think about zea maíz or maize, corn, it still coexists all over Mexico with its wild ancestor, Teocintle or Zea diploperennis. So Zea diploperennis and Zea maíz are neighbors. And in fact, in our own corn at the Acequia Institute, every now and then our corn reverts back to wildness, so that we'll find in the middle of our cornfield, we will find what's called a tunicate. And a tunicate is an intermediary wild form between the Teocintle wild ancestor and the modern domesticated corn. And that's how you know that you have a native landrace variety that's not contaminated by GMOs or even transgenes from hybrid crops. And that's a big issue for us, is to focus on protecting the genetic integrity of our native corn.
Well, and we've lost this idea in modern times. You ask a lot of people, and in all seriousness, they will tell you that their food comes from the grocery store.
That is really unfortunate.
They don't even really understand anymore that it actually comes from the farm that's a couple hundred miles away. But way beyond that, it comes from this deep place in human history where people were first bringing it into domestication. Why is that, in your mind, such an important fact to sort of get your mind around if you want to reclaim your indigenous identity?
Well, if we only have one home, this planet, we need to learn to take care of it. And what you were just saying reminds me of a very alarming fact. It's not just that our children here in the United States don't know where the food comes from. They can name over 100 corporate brands that you'll find at the mall. In contrast, Zapotec children in Mexico, by the age of 10, they can name over 1,000 wild plants that have medicinal properties, that are wild food, or that have some spiritual dimension that's important to the culture. So it seems to me that what's happening to our culture north of the border is that we've lost a sense of place. And that sense of place is really about the bioregional qualities of place. What are the plants, what are the animals that are native to a place? And therefore, what are the traditions and the knowledge practices that people have developed, indigenous peoples have developed? So when we talk about indigeneity, it's really not about identity, it's about knowledge. It's about place-based knowledge is the key to becoming indigenous. And a lot of people have written about this, actually, this whole idea. Gary Snyder even talked about it, about becoming native to this place. The only way to do that is to respect indigenous knowledge, and that applies for everyone, not just indigenous people. So indigeneity for us is about decolonizing our minds, because by decolonizing our minds, we're able to develop a reconnection to our deep heritage sense of place.
In what ways were our minds, or the minds of people, conquered peoples, colonized. And before you can decolonize it, you have to understand what the colonization was.
You have to understand the source. A lot of it has to do with public policies like Americanization, where Mexican children were forced to give up Spanish or their indigenous language. And we have to recognize, for example, in the case of Mexico, there are 68 different native languages. Those are still spoken in Mexico and north of the border. Like I was pointing out earlier today at our conference, there are 500,000 Zapotec speakers all the way from California to Alaska. So the recovery of that language is a difficult proposition, of that linguistic diversity, because of Americanization, where you were forced to assimilate into what was really an Anglo-conformity model. And people weren't given the choice of maintaining both their own cultural attributes, their own skills, their own tacit knowledge, and their own heritage, as well as learning English and becoming familiar with the Constitution and with our rights as U.S. citizens. And this conflation of the idea that somehow you're going to be inhabiting the United States, but you're not somehow indigenous to the United States, which is sort of ironic because we have a saying among the people of Mexico who are north of the border now, we didn't cross the border crossed us.
Right.
And this is the kind of thing that needs to be recognized within our school system, because the ideology and the policy of Americanization has created social conflict, enmity. It has undermined our capacity for understanding the other and for respecting and loving the other. And therefore, it's undermining our capacity for conviviality and for politics of civility that I think Hannah Arendt talked about cohabitation. Cohabitation means love of the other. And this is the key to rethinking the way we handle our public education, because if you want a diverse society, or if you want to recognize that we are a diverse society and that we're very soon going to be a majority-minority nation, there's no changing that demographic trajectory, we need to rethink the way we envision and conceptualize things like public education. But I think a lot of that was lost because of forcible assimilation and Americanization.
Well, you say that cohabitation is understanding the other, loving the other.
Love of the other.
Well, love of the other begins with being able to see the other as something other than a stereotype. And that's what I really appreciate about your work, because particularly these days, I mean, these issues could apply to ethnic groups and various points of tension all over the world. But for us today, it really centers on Latin America, and particularly Mexicans, and how mainstream North Americans think of Mexicans. And you're really trying to broaden that picture and say, here's what goes into the identity, the cultural identity of being a Mexican. Food, music, dance. Help me out. Some of the others that you
Agroecology,
name.
the way we farm, the food we produce, how we produce food. Mathematics, architecture, hydrology, knowledge of medicinal plants. It's an extraordinary range of knowledge that has been suppressed and denied. And I think you just alerted me to the key problem that we face, and that is, if we're going to love the other, we have to know who the other is.
Yes.
And we're not very good. By we, I mean people in the United States, U.S. citizens, are not very good at recognizing their own heritage, let alone the heritage of the other. And until we can arrive at a point where we rediscover who we are, we meaning U.S. citizens, as well as who all the others are, we don't have a chance to set a course for the kind of politics that Hannah Arendt was talking about when she wrote about cohabitation being the love of the other.
And that's such a lofty idea that it's easy to get lost in it. You're like, well, okay, but where do I start? But you've given us places to start. If I wanted to explore my own indigeneity, you've said, look at the food. Look at the agroecology that you grew up with that supports you and has. That's a powerful place to begin. Do you believe that those things apply to any people, anywhere, that anybody can undertake that exploration about themselves?
Absolutely. And I am reminded of an experience we had about 7 or 8 years ago. In the San Luis Valley, we hosted the Ditch and Reservoir Commission organization, DARCA. No, the Ditch and Reservoir Alliance. And it's mainly Anglo farmers from across Colorado who have made a living through the doctrine of prior appropriation, which is part of the Homestead Act, the General Mining Law, and
Sure,
the doctrine of prior appropriation is how the West was settled.
First in time, first in right.
First in time, first in use, first in right. And so the priority system has caused a lot of problems among farmers all over the West. And they came to learn from us because the Acequia law is prior to prior. We're much older than prior appropriation. And to give you some key examples about what they were so excited about to learn from us, these were Anglo corporate agribusiness people from Greeley and so on, and Sterling. And they were just fascinated with two basic ideas that we have. One is our voting is based on one irrigator, one vote. We are a water democracy. The prior appropriation regime is based on how many shares do you have in a ditch company. So if you're a big guy, you can dominate all the small guys. In our system, it doesn't matter how much acreage you have. It's one irrigator, one vote. It's a form of water democracy. And they were looking at that and saying, we kind of want to become like Acequias.
Well, yeah.
And the other thing was the principle of shared scarcity. Is that, that's where prior appropriation has harmed a lot of farmers, is in times of drought, not everyone can irrigate. They issue priority calls, and if you're a junior priority, you're kind of messed up. You're not going to have a good year.
Right.
In our system, it's important to us that our neighbors are as successful as us. And so we have the principle of shared scarcity as part of Acequia customary law. And that means in times of drought, everyone uses less so everyone can have some. There are no priority calls to be issued. And those were the two things. There were other aspects of our Acequia customary law that attracted the modern prior appropriation farmers. But those were the two ideas that really struck them as important and as applicable to any situation. So to respond to that's what the question is about is, we may be unique to the San Luis Valley in northern New Mexico, and a lot of people say, well, Devon, what is it about Acequias? It sounds so special. What can we learn from you that's applicable to other situations? Here comes along DARCA, and they exactly recognize that our governance principles would work almost in any kind of setting. If you want water democracy, Acequias teach you that shared scarcity is a good idea and that one irrigator, one vote is a really good principle.
Well, and that could be applied to a lot of things besides water.
Besides water,
I mean,
yes.
just
Almost
general
anything.
community relations
I agree.
could profit from those
Very
ideas.
much so.
So, practically speaking, though, because we do have prior appropriation so densely written into law across the West, what's the way back? Well, how do you go from there? We've sort of doubled down and doubled down and doubled down on those investments. Is there movement that is offering practical ways to introduce new ideas?
Well, there is a way back, and in fact, Governor Ritter signed a law in 2009 called the Colorado Acequia Recognition Law that I helped develop with Representative Edward Vigil and Senator Gail Schwartz. Working with Joseph C. Gallegos, myself, we wrote this beautiful new law for the state of Colorado as part of the water law that restored some of our governance principles and made Acequias legal entities under Colorado water law. So now we can incorporate, instead as mutual ditch companies, we can incorporate as Acequia companies that are subject to all the customary norms that include mutual aid is another very important principle, so that we can practice the annual spring ditch cleaning is a communal affair. We eat our local foods, we celebrate, and we do the labor together of maintaining and cleaning up and repairing the ditches for the annual irrigation cycle. That's in the law now. Mutual aid, cooperative labor, shared scarcity, the principle of one irrigator, one vote, and some other principles were all integrated under Colorado law when Governor Ritter signed that law in 2009. And what was so interesting about that is that the Republican legislators that I testified in front of, they were just as happy about this as anyone else, because I think they too valued the importance of grassroots democracy. That here is a perfect example of an indigenous grassroots democracy model that can teach us about how to be convivial and how to really create the opportunity for participatory democracy. As you know, if you heard me speaking earlier, I really believe the problem with the United States is we aspire to be a democracy, but we've never really been one. We are a republic of property. The republic of property insists that the most fundamental individual right is private property rights. What Acequias are saying is We want our neighbor to do well. They're as important as me. And
What a
this
concept.
is what a concept. And actually, I think it's a concept that appeals to Americans no matter what their ethnicity or national origin
I
is.
agree with you. It does appeal to individual people. How is it that we've got a nation of individuals who would say, that sounds great, and yet we've got a nation of laws that work in the opposite direction? How did we get there?
That's a very difficult and complicated question, but I do think when people accuse Chicanos and Native Americans and LGBTQ folks of playing identity politics, I have to remind people that this country was founded on identity politics. Only white male property owners could vote. They were the only ones that were empowered to vote. So our original identity politics are white, male, and property owning. And that is where the problem starts, I think, is that it's been a long slog toward expanding the notion not just of the franchise, but of the idea of humanity itself. And we have a very long history, of course, of racism in the society that's part of that same identity politics. And trying to grow out of that has been a very long, hard, difficult struggle. And right now, with the kind of precedent that we have, it really gets that kind of violence and conflict gets augmented. It gets intensifying. And I think we live in a challenging time, but I also see it as a great time of opportunity because people are mobilizing, I think, on a level that's really transformative that I don't remember seeing ever before in this country. And by that, I mean it's a transformative kind of set of relationships because people from all kinds of backgrounds, white folks, Mexicans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Muslims, Christians, secular people. You've never seen such diversity come together, I don't believe, until the past 2 years or so, that we're beginning to see a real citizen-based grassroots movement for a democratic future. I'm very hopeful. I think that the current circumstances are a prelude to, they're like the dying quivers of an old system, an ancien regime that's about to disappear. But it's up to us, and we have to be persistent. We have to draw from our ancestral energy. I have a question for most Americans, for all Americans. What kind of ancestor do you want to be?
Well, we had John Hausdorfer in here talking about that very thing.
This is something that John and I talk about all the time. Is what kind of ancestor do we wish to be? And I think we have to decide whether we want a country that's known for putting indigenous children inside of cages and detention centers that they get trapped in sexual trafficking, or do we really want to become a shining city on the hill? We've never been that. Let's do that. Let's become that.
Well, and that conversation is exemplified by children in cages, but it certainly is not limited to that because we've got children that are being ignored and marginalized all over the country, being left in poverty, being denied education, being denied health care, so forth. So the question is very valid for lots and lots of people.
Well, and the only way to deal with that, I think, is we have to rethink not only whether we're a republic or a democracy, but we have to rethink what we mean by wealth. Now, wealth is another misconception. We think wealth is how much money you have. Mexicans, when we think of wealth, is how close are you to your family? That's wealth. And we're a culture of we, not I. And I'm not denying the importance of individuality, but it's very interesting, Alan, that if you look at the more than 1,000 indigenous languages in the Western Hemisphere, not a single one has the word individual in them. Not one. That word doesn't exist in indigenous languages. and that presents a real challenge, philosophical, political, cultural challenge, because we're so accustomed, especially since the 1850s, that's when individual rights began to be institutionalized within jurisprudence in the United States. It's really only until the 1850s that we begin to talk a lot about the individual. It's not a common word in English until the 1850s, even in the United States. So although we have words for person, for brother, sister, uncle, mother, grandmother, we don't have a word for individual in all these indigenous languages. And so that means something. It means that we need to recognize that part of our resilience, of our ability to bounce back from trauma and violence and uncertainty, is each other. And we have a concept that we use a lot in Chicano studies when we're teaching philosophy. It's from the Mayan Popol Vuh, an origin story, and the word is in la quech. In la quech means in Spanish, tú eres mi otro yo, or you are my other me, you are my other self. And it's a song to birds It's not a song to human beings, but it's a song to birds. You are my other self. But that concept of in la quech, that ethno-philosophy of in la quech, is a beautiful example of the kind of philosophical normative worldviews, cosmovisions, if you will, that we're able to offer to the world as indigenous peoples, that I think a lot of us would agree with that. Yes, it's important to be a person. It's important to be self-actualizing. But you can't do that without family, community, without the institutions that families and communities have been creating for so long. So in order to democratize and free these institutions, we need to rethink wealth. And I like to point out often in my own classes at the University of Washington to students that we have to make a choice between objectivity and relationality. Objectivity gets people to separate facts from values. And that's one of the most dangerous mythologies about Western knowledge, is the positivism, the idea that you can even separate facts from values. Just the facts, ma'am. You know, Francis Bacon. But
Sure.
Bacon said, you know what, I'm a technologist. I want to deliver the goods to the empire so that it can conquer. I want to make sure we get rid of the witches because I know they're midwives, but if men are going to take over medicine, we need to get rid of them. I mean, that's values.
Yes.
Right? From the founder of the scientific method. He was really motivated by values. And so, in la quech means relationality. You are my other self. I'm one with all my relations. Mitakoyo yasin, the Lakota like to say. And for me, that represents a very important difference that we need to recognize and cherish, the idea that maybe relationality is something we ought to explore more if we have any hope of becoming a democratic society in the future.
Well, and okay, so the song is to birds, but it could be to other people. It should be to other people. So here's the question for you then, because the trend over the last number of decades has been toward homogeneity, a homogenizing of human culture. Culture has just done that sort of automatically. You know, we consume the same sorts of mental food, and it has that effect. And that was held up as some sort of virtue, that to take people and sort of level the cultural differences that we have out. Are you suggesting that we still need to be a global family? We still need to see ourselves as you're my other me, as you put it. Does that, in your mind, is that strengthened by reclaiming particular cultural identity? I mean, finding out what it means to be a Mexican, finding out what it means to be Vietnamese if you're a second generation American citizen, so forth. Can we still work toward collectivism under those circumstances?
I like to use the metaphor of the salad bowl that I talked about earlier today. We often hear about the United States being a melting pot society.
That's what I'm talking about.
And the melting pot society is really what my mentor, Joe Fagan, called the Anglo-conformity model. And when you force people, you cannot legislate cultural conformity. History teaches us you cannot do that. It's been tried thousands of times. It's always failed. You cannot legislate cultural conformity. Instead of a melting pot, we should recognize that we already are a salad bowl society where the tomato keeps its distinctive flavor, the red onion, the jicama, the lettuce, the kale, and all these beautiful ingredients are distinct, and yet they're in harmonious synthesis. It's like a symphony orchestra. So for me, the salad bowl model of our society is one that is more hopeful, more positive, that allows for individual and cultural distinctiveness, but we're all in the same bowl. And that bowl is the framework of our institutions. Now, those institutions must be informed by cultural values. And that's where the most troubling challenge comes from. If people are going to be able to create a salad bowl society, we need to participate in the shaping of the bowl before we put all the ingredients in. And that means rethinking American democracy.
Well, okay, I get this picture in my mind of all these beautiful colors in the bowl, the red and the green and the deep purple of the onion. Popular culture has turned the color white, it's not really white, it's Caucasian, let's call it, into something that is almost, at times, it's almost as if we're wanting to kick it out of the bowl. How do we get past this place where there's a lot of what you've called, I think, historical trauma, intergenerational historical trauma? How do we move past that? Because there's no doubt that white culture has caused a lot of harm. But we have this imperative. If we're going to survive as a species, we have to do it together, and that includes white people. What do you say to that?
I would start with recognition that white people have also faced intergenerational historical trauma, that it's not a uniquely Native American thing. In the context of the United States, certainly Native Americans have faced intergenerational historical trauma because of the behavior of white settler colonialism. There's no dispute about that.
Right.
I think it was Frantz Fanon who noted that the colonizer is as injured as the colonized, that the colonizers may be the ones perpetrating violence, but when you engage in an act of violence, that's traumatic.
Yes, it is.
That's why our soldiers, our warriors, have PTSD.
And a very high suicide rate.
And so we need to, when white folks become aware of the fact that they too are damaged goods because of settler colonialism, that will, I think, open up doors and windows for conversations for healing. That opens up the possibility of healing.
That's what was behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, was that very idea.
Yes, it is. That's right.
And do you see signs that we may be moving in that direction, or do we still have work to do to even get the various sides to that point?
Alan, I'm afraid we're going to have to undo a lot of the damage of the current administration when we live in a time where truth is alternative facts. When everything's fake news if our executives disagree with the facts on the ground. So it's going to be challenging to move along that path, but it's not impossible. And I think the example would also be what's happened in Chile after Pinochet. And the way they approached it was, before we can have truth and reconciliation, we need to have justice. All the members of the military junta who murdered people must be brought to justice. Once you do that, then we can have truth and reconciliation, because some of the truth will come out of the trials against those who committed crimes. Now, I'm not saying we need to have mass trials of white people, but we need to have accountability and an honest accounting of the crimes that have been committed. Like, for example, recently a young man, a white man, gave several hundred acres of land back to the Ute Nation here in the San Luis Valley. That's an act of truth and reconciliation, but it's about justice, about land justice for the Ute Nation. And those kind of acts done by individuals are very much a part of what I envision as the kind of path we can lead back toward reconciliation and truth.
Well, one of the clues that we're looking for, I think, is in the very word reconciliation. You have to reconcile. You have to balance those books in a way that can't be done with just words or empty gestures. Short of giving land back, what are the sort of things that you would say we could begin to do today to move in this direction?
Part of it depends on what do we mean by we. And because I think indigenous people, we need accomplices and allies, but a lot of what we want to do is we don't want to sit at your table, we want to make our own table. Now, that doesn't mean we want to be separatists. It just means that if we're going to have, for example, higher education, it would be nice for us to start taking control of our own institutions of higher education, creating alternative institutions. In fact, the Acequia Institute is part of a group called the Alianza Milpa that grew out of our testimony before the Convention on Biological Diversity in Cancun 2 years ago in 2016. One of our goals, because we have about 103 corn growers, is to create a network, an intercontinental indigenous university of corn, where we can begin to educate the next generation of corn farmers who will be working with people from all kinds of backgrounds, including all the First Nation people, but white accomplices and allies as well, so that we can all share in the knowledge of indigenous agroecology and then take it out on the ground. This is so it depends on what we mean by we. And I think there are things that need to happen in terms of autonomous organization of indigenous people, like having our own institutions of higher learning. In fact, the Aztecs had a word for it. It was called a calmecac. A calmecac was an institution of higher learning. But we also need to begin to open doors to the other institutions, the mainstream institutions, like all our institutions of higher education, universities and colleges. Part of this will be determined, I think, by the demographic transition as we move to a majority-minority nation and so-called white population becomes a minority. A lot of these institutions will change just by the sheer presence and the sheer reality of the demographics. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now in terms of white racial violence is built on an anxiety and fear of this coming demographic transition. We need to educate people about there's nothing to fear. Do we really want to end up in a situation like apartheid in South Africa where a white minority is ruling it over everyone else? That's not going to work. It didn't work there. It won't work here. No. So it's very important to recognize the steps that we need to take to make our institutions more inclusive. And I don't mean just in terms of who's there, who's attending. By inclusive, I mean whose knowledge is represented in these institutions. It's very important to understand that a lot of the solutions to questions of sustainability, the climate chaos crisis, all of those are indigenous lessons to be drawn here, that we have technologies, we have scientific traditions that will help the world address questions of sustainability and resilience. And that will be part of what I would say is the movement toward inclusiveness in our institutions.
Well, and we're back to the concept we touched on earlier, and that is cohabitation must include the concept of love for the other. And so it's not just about gathering the right knowledge, pushing the right buttons. This is about the fostering of compassion and empathy. And that's what I love about your work. Because if I understand more about the traditional dances of Mexican people, and where their food came from, and in fact, the fact that that's my food, and that I owe my dinner plate to this long traditional history, I'm much more likely to
love the other.
To love the other.
Yes. Knowledge is a beautiful thing. Bacon said knowledge is power, and Foucault said yes, and where there's knowledge, where there's power, there's resistance. So Bacon says knowledge is power, and Foucault answers yes, and wherever there's power, there's resistance. By resistance, I mean opening up this idea of knowledge, of power knowledge, as something that involves all of us, and that where you have multiple sources of origin that strengthens us. Look, let's recall something from Aldo Leopold. He was a big defender of biological diversity because he understood that diversity is good for the land organism. But he also understood and he believed that as diversity was good for the land organism, it was also good for the society, that cultural diversity was as important to the health of a society as biological diversity is to the health of the land. So the great Aldo Leopold understood that, and I think we need to bring that back to the table and teach people the important land ethics are really also about cultural ethics.
Do you think that evolution, human evolution, is going to require that of us, that we have to get there in order to maintain our existence on the planet?
I think the question might be rephrased a little bit to, is the current capitalist regime undermining natural evolutionary processes that encourage conviviality and cohabitation? And I think the answer is yes. I've had long debates with climate scientists. It took me 20 years to convince some of them that there was a third C word, climate change, capitalism. And we don't really understand that. We fetishize. We have this bizarre, romantic, really distorted, unreal notion of what capitalism is. And people say, well, what, Peña, are you a communist? And I always respond, you may have heard me say this, I'm a communist, not a communist. I believe in the commons. We have one planet. It's our common home. Everybody. Doesn't matter who you are, what nation, nationality, ethnic group. I don't believe in race. There's one race, the human race. So it doesn't matter who we are. We have a common home. And that's what I mean by a communist. We need to treat the planet as our commons.
Well, thank you for all that you do to bring that
pleasure.
idea to us. And I wish we had 2 more hours, but we don't. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you, Alan, for inviting me.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think Planet.